Thank you, everybody, for joining this episode of Desert Island Diaries. As you know, the purpose behind these is for me to interview people that have made a real difference to public service, and our public servants have got a career around public service. And I really enjoy doing these interviews because I just love being a sponge and listening to their careers and what they've done, how they've done it, what they've learned. And there's a lot we can learn to help our careers, and we can improve, everything that we do. That's the plan. So I'll let Brendan introduce himself more formally in a minute. But we, like many of my connections, are connected through LinkedIn. I was really impressed by your emphasis and focus on humanity, which for me is a massive part of what we do and why we do it. I'll let you talk that through in a lot more detail. But just before we get going, you might see behind me, I'm just going to ask you now about what drink you'd like. So you're on the hammock, and just there's a table you can see. There's 2 drinks on there. So what drink are you going to order to kick us off?
Well, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
It's Rioja Clacker, 4 o'clock.
I think it's going to be tea, I'm afraid. Nice cup of tea.
Okay, can't go wrong with a cup of tea. We'll have the Rioja afterwards.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fantastic. So can you just give us sort of a 60-second overview of your career, and then we'll get into the detail after that, just to give everybody a bit of context.
Well, I haven't really had a career, to be honest, Anthony. I'm still hoping there's still time, but so far I've avoided it. So I started off back in the day as a journalist. I was an industrial reporter and a sports reporter. Did both of them at the same time. Up in Scotland for about 5 years, recording the changes in the industrial landscape in Scotland, Monday to Friday, and reporting from either Rangers or Celtic on the Saturday. And then I went on from there to freelance journalism, and from there to working for a trade union, which at that time was called NALGO. That stood for the National and Local Government Officers Association. It since then has merged into a bigger union called Unison. And for them, I was a policy and research officer, focusing in particular, and we're talking about the mid 80s now, focusing in particular on privatization of public services, a challenge that unions had not previously had. And I learned a great deal about public services through that job. Sorry, something came up on my screen. I learned a great deal about public services, but also because NALGO was very strong on international relations, about once a month it would be my job to do a seminar for a visiting delegation of trade unions from other countries. And it was really interesting because over a couple of years, I must have done maybe 15 or 20 seminars for trade union delegations from many different countries. And I learned that privatization was increasingly a global phenomenon. And I became interested. They were coming to Britain because, of course, it was associated internationally very much with the Thatcher government of the 1980s. But what I was learning from them was that it was becoming international. I became interested in why it was international. And what I realized was privatization was actually a key component of the globalization agenda. And so when from about 1990 onwards, I left NALGO and went freelance, I wrote a book about privatization and globalization called In the Public Interest. And that book led to quite a lot of interest in what I had to say, because what I was arguing in that book was that privatization was the wrong answer to a good question. The good question being, why are public services so bureaucratic? Why are there so many inefficiencies in them? And what can be done to make them better? And increasingly, what I realized needed to be done to make them better was to engage them much more strongly with the communities they serve, and to enable conditions in which the professionals in them can build the kinds of relationships they need with each other, with other organizations, and above all, with the people they serve. to be able to work in a way that is really responsive to those needs. So from there, it wasn't a very big leap towards my second book, which was looking at examples around the world. By this time, I was being employed a lot as a freelance consultant and traveling all over the world, working for unions, working sometimes for international institutions such as the International Labour Organization and the World Bank occasionally, and also working for NGOs. And so whenever I was making a trip like that, if I could, I tried to tag on some research time. And this ended up with a book looking at a range of examples from all around the world of where public services were being improved and democratized through better involvement of the communities that they were serving, and through an enabling workplace environment to support professionals to work with greater freedom and responsibility. And that led to my second book, and continued to do consultancy work from there. And then around 20.
What was your second book called, Brendan?
In the Public Service.
Okay.
And then from there I decided around 2010 that if I knew anything about this subject, by then I was very, very interested and really focused on the experience of self-organized teamwork in public service organizations, which was on the increase around the world. And I decided if I know anything about this, I really want to apply it to sorting some of the problems of public services in Britain, where I live. And it coincided with needing to stay home more. I was looking after my mum a lot towards the end of her life. And when she died, I decided I really wanted to focus on bringing together all of the body of knowledge that I developed over many years of work into trying to do something about, in particular, home care, and which led in turn to an interest in the most successful startup in the community services internationally, probably a company in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg, which is the Dutch for neighborhood care. And from about 2015 onwards, we began a collaboration with, 10 years ago now, we began a collaboration with Buurtzorg, since when we've worked in about 40 different settings around Britain and Ireland, exploring how to introduce the principles that have made Buurtzorg in the Netherlands so successful into the different institutional and cultural environments of British public services. And now we have a deep and rich and quite wide body of knowledge about the barriers and challenges of doing that. And I'm writing currently a booklet on that 10-year experience, which will be launching at an event we're organizing on the 18th of March in London.
Wow.
That was more than 60 seconds, but it did cover the whole life. It
was. I feel like you need to get that fire going behind you, and we forget the red wine. I'll just come over for a whiskey.
You'll be very welcome.
Did I send you my book? I think I might have done when we connected just to arrange this. Because it feels like there's a massive amount of common ground. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it yet, but
I've read your book, and I absolutely, as you say, there's an enormous amount of common ground. And what I particularly liked about your book, which I was incredibly impressed by, because the way you've gone on from gathering all of that information and testimony from the nurses, which is really, really rich testimony. There aren't many examples of where nurses in particular have just been allowed to speak about their experience in the way that you've allowed them to do. So that's a great service in itself. But how you've extrapolated from that to some of the organizational solutions that you're suggesting, as you say, there are many common themes.
Yeah, well, it's really amazing to hear. I'm really pleased that you think that as well, because I was sort of warned off to a degree around doing it from some significant people in the NHS.
Well, I'm not surprised.
But I just felt like I couldn't sanitize it. I felt like it had to come out.
You've done a great job, in my opinion.
Oh well, so for somebody like you, that's really an honor to hear. I really appreciate that. Wow, this is going to be a really interesting interview. That experience is crazy. So the first question I normally ask, which I really love, is your childhood and growing up, and how has that influenced your? I know we've just touched on the career, but has that had an influence? Do you think, looking back and looking at your childhood, has that influenced who you've become and where you've gone and why you've done that?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, where to start with that? We really would need to crack open a bottle of whiskey and get into that. I'm the fifth son of an Irish immigrant couple to Britain. Like many migrating families, it took my mum and dad 9 years to be able to live under the same roof all the time, with my dad first of all coming over for work, leaving my mum behind, then being able to bring my mum over from time to time with my elder brothers who were born in Ireland. I'm the fifth of the five, and the two youngest, including me, were born in Britain. But the family was not brought together until I was 2 years old, and everybody could be brought back from wherever they'd been left with relatives. This is a very common migrant experience. You look at West Africans today in Britain, it's going to be quite a similar pattern. So of course that affects you in ways that you can't be aware of. But also, being an Irish family in a part of London without other Irish families at that time was easy for me, but probably not that easy for my dad, who arrived in Britain at a time when you could see signs saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So this was the welcoming committee that he received. So getting through all that and finding ways to establish themselves, this must have been very tough for my parents, but we had a nice childhood and managed to get decent educations in the British education system. But yeah, I mean, if I had to say one thing about it, I'd say probably I've always had a sense of being an outsider, and I've never been really an insider. And whenever I have been inside any organization for very long, I've still felt like an outsider. And I think that's pretty much part of my makeup.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what do you think the implications of that are? Does it push you to drive harder and do more work and innovate, or how does that manifest itself?
Well, not so far. I wouldn't say I've ever been pushed to do a lot more work. I think what it does push me I grew up in a family environment. My parents were Republicans, Irish Republicans, and became members of the Communist Party, in fact, in Britain. And I suppose I grew up with a strong sense of never taking anything that you were told for granted, always challenging what you were told. And I have always taken that to extremes, to be honest. And sometimes it's even led me to be really skeptical about people who really know what they're talking about and what they're saying, when actually it might have been better, more wise to listen and learn and read before opening my mouth and saying what I thought. Over the years, I've learned how to do that. But when I was a younger man, I was a much more, I would say I was much less reticent about shouting the odds. And perhaps it took a few decades of growing a little bit wiser to realize that actually isn't very helpful.
Yeah. I suppose we all go through that journey, don't we?
I don't know.
Do you think that communist element, which I don't think it's a terrible thing, do you think that was an influence on you getting involved with the trade union work?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with the assumption that the that capitalism was an oppressive system and had to be resisted and overthrown. I mean, that was basically the set of assumptions I grew up with.
Yeah.
The way I go about it these days is very different and the way I look at it and the way I frame it and understand the world these days is, of course, very different. But that, for me, in my family environment, that was the norm. And so it would have been very odd not to have that sort of mindset that actually, be very skeptical of everything you hear, and challenge the status quo and challenge authority. It was just normal.
Yeah, brilliant. And it sort of felt like when you were introducing that trade union work really did lead you down the path that you've gone down, which has led to the absolute focus on services and public sector services.
Well, in more than one way, actually, Anthony. Firstly, the content of the work, as I mentioned a minute or two ago, it did, because I began to see how these patterns of public service reform, to give it a polite term, and privatization and commercialization and the introduction of market mechanisms into public services, I began to see how that was a very important strategic part of the globalization, if you like, the neoliberal agenda of globalization. That was becoming obvious. But it's actually, in another way, I'd say it was even more of an education, because no disrespect to Nalgo or to Unison, but and I've explained a bit about my own personality, but I just found an incredibly stifling environment working in a union. It wasn't because of what it stood for. It was just so bureaucratic, so hierarchical, so rigid in the way things were done. And when I started, I was kind of naive. I mean, I had a job to do, and I started forming interdepartmental project teams, assuming that people would be able to come to which is what we needed, because we were campaigning against privatization of water and outsourcing in the health service. So we needed interdisciplinary teams, people from the education department, the comms department, etc., and me from the research and policy department. But we could never bring these teams, so we could bring these teams together to talk about it. But in every case, they would have to go upwards through their departmental hierarchy to get and budget to do anything. And we could never get it fast enough. So it was a real lesson to me in the way bureaucracies work. And it's quite possible I learned more about how bureaucracies work by working for a trade union than I did about the actual content of the work I was doing.
That is really fascinating. So in my experience, I worked for the NHS as an employee for 5 years, and I had to come out because I felt like I was completely constrained and restricted, and I wanted to do a lot more. And I felt that I can do more on the outside, supporting in, than I can on the inside, if you like. And I've seen and viewed, and my opinion, as in the book, is that I feel that organizations like the NHS are the culture's so command and control driven. And I think that's a sort of fed from scientific management and this belief that siloed working and specialisms is the most efficient and effective way to manage things. And that's where all the command and control and bureaucracy comes from. So I sort of understand that, and I've lived with it.
And you have the scars to prove it.
Yeah, but now you've just raised something, which is why do trade unions fall into that trap? Because you would imagine there's a lot more freedom and flexibility. But then I'm assuming, my hypothesis would be, people have worked in councils and the NHS, which are command and control driven largely, and they've probably come out of them to form unions. Maybe I don't know. I'd love your view on it.
Well, I haven't studied it enough, and I've only worked for one union. That union modeled its structures and its modus operandi on local government. So one of the strengths of that union, it was very much a lay member led organization. The national executive and the sectoral committees had real authority in a way that in some other unions they didn't, and for all I know still don't. So that was interesting, but the downside of it was that it was like the it was very inflexible. It didn't. It had an inbuilt sense that, and in some ways, this has its positive side, an inbuilt sense that the staff of the union were there to serve the committees. But the committees themselves tended to be, I don't know, I'd have to think about it a bit more than I have, to be honest, which is inexcusable, really, since it's a long time ago. But so I'd see it as a double-edged thing. On the one hand, unions are democratically run. On the other hand, they tend to be quite. No, let me put this another way. And you can see it actually in the way the Labour government now is behaving. There is a tendency in unions to do things for their members, rather than to create conditions in which the members can do things for themselves. Now, you're seeing a change in that with some of the unions who are really enabling their members to drive industrial action to support whatever fight they're having, which is one thing. What unions have tended to be less interested in is the how their members can be more engaged in the organizations in which they work. In other words, unions, by their nature, tend to be, and for understandable reasons, interested in the terms and conditions of their members' employment rather than what they're actually doing, and would they be getting more job satisfaction, and would they be developing their careers in more interesting ways, and would they be enjoying life more if they were able to exercise more authority about the way the work is done. Unions have tended to see that as beyond their role, and indeed getting into a realm of management, which unions tend to say, well, that's management's job. Our job is to protect our people and their terms and conditions. So it's understandable.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So that the union's role is almost adversarial in terms of it us and them, and conflict and head bashing.
Well, or negotiation. I mean, unions like NALGO very seldom went out on strike, but they negotiated a lot, and they had a lot of confidence in the institutionalized negotiating arrangements through which they would protect and advance the employment rights and the pay and conditions and terms of their members. And they became pretty good at doing that in an environment in which the economy was expanding. They were, however, when phenomena like privatization came along, and this was the frustration for me, which I worked very hard to try to change. When that came along, it was not, you couldn't resisting privatization was not enough, because it was futile actually, unless you were really able to mobilize much more than unions were able to. Because what was really needed then, and we tried to develop it, was an alternative agenda of public service change. I mean, this is very little known, and one day I'll probably write it up. But when the Tory government in the 1980s first proposed privatization of water, they ended up withdrawing their plans for the privatization of water, partly because in NALGO and with other unions involved, we were able to build and did build a strong coalition of unions and environmental organizations and others concerned about what the impact of privatization of water would be. And this was unprecedented. It was the third, and there was a lot of suspicion about it in NALGO when I was working there. But we with colleagues, we built this coalition, about 70 different organizations. We produced some research about the problems of the water industry, of the water authorities in England and Wales. We were honest about the deficiencies of service. I mean, I kid you not, one of the things I discovered when I was researching it was that England and Wales at that time had fewer beaches meeting European Union standards than Luxembourg had. Luxembourg's landlocked. So, this was system was then. It was indefensible. The quality of the service was indefensible. And the government was right and was indeed pushing in an open door about doing something about that. The problem is that their solution, privatization, was never going to work and was always going to lead to what we've seen since and what we're dealing with now. That was inevitable. And we said that at the time. But what we really needed to do was to build a coalition and advance an alternative agenda for change, which is exactly what we did do. So they withdrew those proposals. The trouble is they then won the next election and they came back in with fresh proposals which satisfied some of the environmentalist conditions, such as by setting up the regulator for environmental standards. So the environmentalists were then more satisfied and the coalition fell apart. In any case, it was a fresh new Tory government with a lot more wind in its sails. But that was an example where it was effective to advance an alternative agenda of public service reform. But in general, unions have been very poor at doing that.
Yeah. Okay, that's fascinating history. It feels like there's another book in you there. I want to touch on human learning systems. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but it feels like, again, there's a massive crossover there with another significant movement, which I feel, and another little hypothesis because I'm not close enough, but it feels like that's very close to the work you're doing with the Netherlands organization. But maybe we can come on to that. Just a quick one before that. My view, and you'll be on top of this in terms of Margaret Thatcher's approach and privatization and all that sort of thing. I think this is more of a capitalist approach that I'm coming to here, but I think there's a real strong view that you can only make progress and you can only develop and you can only improve based on that human instinct to want to do things for your own selfish needs, if you like. And I think, and the more I do these interviews with people like you, the more I believe that isn't necessarily the case. So I think there's lots of people that are brilliant, that are motivated, that are innovative, that can make massive change happen, that aren't in it for themselves. They're in it to do the right thing. I don't know if this is resonating with you, but I just don't agree that the only way humans progress is through that selfish greed element of trying to do things better and improve things. So this is no, I don't normally talk at this level, but I think you're the man to do it with. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think you mentioned at the beginning that what our offer that we make to public service organizations, which is based on my lifetime of learning, and in particular the last decade of work in partnership with Buurtzorg, and we for most of that time we had a formal partnership with Buurtzorg, but we no longer do that. But we've through working with in NHS organizations, in local authorities, in social enterprises, in social housing, across a number of settings, we've learned a great deal about the challenges of introducing higher levels of responsibility for professionals in those organizations. What does it take in terms of organizational change, in terms of system change, to create the conditions for that kind of flourishing? And so we think we understand a lot about that now. My goodness, we should do. We've been really experimenting like this for 10, 15 years. So we brought it together in an offer. The umbrella name of which we give is called Humanity at the Heart. And indeed, we've set up an online community for anybody who wants to join and talk about it. Why have we called it Humanity at the Heart? Well, it's because for us, humanity has a double meaning there. Yes, it means humanity in the sense of compassion, all of the positive qualities about humaneness, if you like, humanity in the way we treat each other, in the way in which public services look after people. Yes, we mean it in that sense, but we also mean it in the more complicated sense that humanity and the human condition is rather complex. And for us, that's just as important as the other meaning of humanity, because actually I totally agree with you, of course, that we are not simply selfish beings, but we are not simply collaborative and cooperative beings either. I think we have both of these in our makeup, and I think it's important to understand in the context of public service reform that everybody involved, yes, is working away to do things for others, and with a spirit of altruism and with a spirit of public service guiding them, but they also have their own interests. They have their own careers to think about. They have their own job satisfaction to think about. They have their own livelihoods to think about, and they have their own pride to think about. And all of these things are motivators for people. So I think, talking about humanity means talking about something that is complex in its nature, and of course is existing all the time in incredibly complex systemic environment as well.
That's a brilliant answer. Really, really great answer. So I feel like there's so much there in your last 15 years of experience that we probably need to focus on that if we can. There's probably so much we can learn from that 15 years of working in these environments and making these changes happen. So where's the best place to start with that then? So my instinct is, I guess we know, and most of the people that will listen to this will know, the challenges with public sector organisations at the moment. I think it's across the board. I think it's NHS, I think it's councils, I think it's schools, completely overwhelmed, exhausted, stressed out workforce. How do you move from that to what I feel like I understand where you've got to, but how do you move from that very difficult environment to one that is thriving? They are doing the right things. They are improving the services for citizens. They're enjoying themselves whilst they do it, and productivity and outcomes are massively improving as well. What's the journey there? How you managed to do it?
Well, ask me again in 20 years, and I'll tell you how we did it. What we've learned over the last 10 or 15 is, firstly, as you say, public servants are under a great deal of stress and moral distress in many cases, particularly in the NHS, but not only there, and are desperate for change. I mean, desperate. You know this, from all the nurses you spoke to. And what we have found is, where there is leadership in organizations that is willing to take the risk of creating conditions in which those professionals at the doing the primary process work, or sometimes known as the front line, for obvious reasons we try to avoid that term, but those professionals doing the primary process work, where there has been leadership to enable experimentation for those who want to experiment, to work in self-organized teams, to be able to work with greater freedom and responsibility to make the relationships they need with the people they serve. There are plenty of public servants who will jump at the chance. And we have had great success with the teams that we've supported to do that, in terms of increased job satisfaction, very strong indicators about reducing turnover of staff, other indicators about improving enjoyment of work, and of course, more importantly, or just as importantly, the quality of the work that they've been able to do. So far, so good. Where it's become difficult is where you're essentially, to do that, what we needed to do is create a sort of protected environment in a larger organization in which this experimentation can take place. So we do things like support the organization to set up what we call a mid-office, which is a sort of a one-stop shop for the self-organized teams that we provide learning and development support to, so that when they have an issue, or something that they need support from their organization with. They got a single point of contact, they can go to it, and then that point of contact can deal with all of the administrative, the support services in the organization. So that works well as a transition arrangement. Where it becomes difficult is you've then got a small oasis of one culture developing within a larger organization, which is quite hostile. I don't mean it personally. I mean in which there is, a very different and unwelcoming culture and environment, and that environment is being shaped by all of these other pressures on service organizations, not only their own cultures, not only their own structures, which are usually very hierarchical and siloed, we all know that, but even more so the systems beyond them and the political pressures that they're under. So it becomes very difficult to grow that. And we found that's the obstacle. I mean, one of the projects that we were involved with was we supported 3 organizations in Kent, an NHS Foundation Trust, a social enterprise that had spun out from the NHS called Medway Community Health, and Kent County Council. So 3 different organizations. This was an international project involving France and Belgium as well. And we, over a 4 or 5 year period, what we were doing with them was experimenting with the introduction of the principles and some of the methodologies that are used successfully by Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, to find out, firstly, are the professionals able to adopt this way of working if they want to, and if they volunteer to be those who are experimenting? Answer, yes. Secondly, are they able to produce better results as a consequence of doing so? Answer, yes. Is their organization able to provide them consistently with the support that they need to enable them to do this increasingly successful? That's a bit more dodgy. Is the IT system suited to it? Not really. Are the management structures and so on suited to it? Not at all. Is the wider system operating in such a way as to create conditions for this sort of experimentation to flourish and to grow and become the norm? And we identified through that project, and on our website publicworld.com you can find all the detailed reports of this. The participants in the project identified 250 specific barriers and challenges to working in this way. And we then did some analysis of those barriers and challenges and could see that essentially most of them were to do with the way the system operates. So in a nutshell, what was happening was that these promising, in some cases, in other cases more than promising, obviously successful experimentations at a small scale were colliding with the systemic obstacles. And to be honest, within the public sector so far, we found there's only one winner when that collision takes place. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's all collapsed. There are still teams. We started working with Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust, supporting the development of self-organized teamwork in their community services 10 years ago. Last time I checked, there are still teams working in that way. It's an adapted form. It's not the same way as they do it in Buurtzorg, and obviously it's not. It'd be mad if it was, but because the systems are different. But the principles at the bottom of it are the same, and I think that's really brought about some benefits for the professionals concerned. And above all, I mean, there's some wonderful stories of the experience there of how being able to work in a much more responsive and flexible way to start to, and in a strengths-based way, especially when nurses were able to go out and work and build a relationship, begin to see what the strengths were of somebody who was presenting with lots of problems and weaknesses, build on those strengths, enable that person to start to build on their own strengths, but also to draw in other assets that are available to them in their family, in the neighborhood, in the community. There were some great examples of fantastic results, which were joyous, really joyous for the people concerned, including the professionals. But the struggle with establishing this as an organizational norm, let alone a systemic norm, is the way in which the system pushes back against this. And this is going to take time. I'm afraid. This is why I say 20 years. It is gradually changing. And we're working with a wonderful organization and have been doing for 5 years in Scotland, the THISL Foundation. It's an advantage for THISL that they're relatively smaller than an NHS Foundation Trust, and also that they're relatively more autonomous. Nevertheless, they are entirely reliant, or pretty much entirely reliant, on public sector contracts and public sector funding, with all of that involved. And of course, it's a very regulated environment. But over the 5 years, we've now worked with around 20 teams which are working in a self-organized way. They have a THISL hub, they call it, which is basically the kind of one-stop shop I talked about earlier. They have a team of coaches that is able to support these self-organized teams increasingly well, and they're on their way. And we, in fact, just yesterday had a call with them about what it'll look like for the next couple of years in our collaboration. So it can happen, but we've got to take it step by step, but not just in an incremental way. But I think learning all the time about how each step we're taking has implications and lessons for how we need to change organizational arrangements and aspects of the system and the political mindsets and the leadership mindsets, and just keep making that a learning process all the way through.
There's so much in common between what your work and the human learning systems work. If you've not come across that, I must put you in touch with them. And I
have come across them. I have indeed. I think Buurtzorg, I don't think they acknowledge this explicitly. I don't know if they do or not. But I think Buurtzorg and the work we've done was what some of their influences. Yes, and actually, and the people who go under the umbrella of human learning systems have looked at some of these kinds of experimentations and drawn their own conclusions about what's going on there. And as you say, there are some common features and also some that are different.
Yeah, it'd be great to explore the differences. But I was just back to the leadership, and I don't know if the word you used earlier was bravery, leadership bravery, to enable this to kick off, to let it flourish almost. Just brings me back. I interviewed in a similar interview with Professor Toby Lowe, who was one of the human learning systems drivers. And he was saying that he was working in a council environment, and his view was, let's work my way up, work hard, work my way up into a position of more power, so therefore I'll have more influence. And he had a realization that actually the people that typically have the power don't actually use it in the way we'd want it to be used. So they almost get there and then they don't do all these things in terms of bravery and allowing this flourishing to happen. They almost, I asked the question, do you think that they were never the right leaders in the first place to be that sort of a leader? Or have they just got sucked in and their identity has become this fixed bureaucratic command and control type leader? And it's a difficult one to answer, and I don't think he could really answer it. But
this goes. So I don't think I do agree with that. No, at least it's not the way I would frame it. What we found is that you got to take into account that organizational leaders and system leaders in public service environments have got huge, just getting through day to day for any public service organization at the moment is a challenge, right?
Yeah.
We all know that. All of the pressures on public service leaders are enormous. For them, the risk of what looks like a release of command and control can be very costly. Our experience is that actually the control of the top-down hierarchical systems is illusory anyway.
Absolutely.
And actually you get a lot more if you base your confidence on the capabilities and the capacities and build of the people that are working with you, provided they are the right people and have had the right training. And if they haven't, they shouldn't be working for you. And so, by the way, this is not all puppy dogs and all of that. This needs a hard edge. If you want people to work with higher levels of freedom and responsibility, they got to be committed to that. And you've got to not only create the conditions in which people are enabled and supported to do that, in which case, probably 90% of professionals in public services will do it, but you've also got to be very vigilant and transparent about the results. And you've got to deal with, learn from successes and learn from failures, but you've also got to be rigorous, and you've got to be you've got to be sure that you're able to see what is going on in the organization and make corrections as you go. But it's the way you make those corrections is one of the differences. So if you think that, we've worked in there was one place we worked where we supported a couple of social care teams to work as self-organized teams, and they were going very well. But then there was a problem in one of those teams. This was the moment of challenge for the leadership of that organization to say, okay, this is where the way in which we deal with this, the way in which we have conversations about it, the way in which we treat this as a learning opportunity could be, by that time we'd built up quite a bit of trust. This was crucial to further building that trust, but also dealing with that problem. Instead, there was a tendency to revert to the administrative solutions rather than the more creative ones. And of course, that damaged trust, and it meant that not enough was learned about how you prevent those problems coming up in an environment in which there is greater freedom and responsibility. So that was but at the same time, even as that was happening, I could understand the point of view of the senior leaders. They were not, if they felt that the only way that they could reassert control was doing what they understood, doing what was culturally going with the grain, doing what would be expected of them by regulators, etc., and all of those other norms that they're working to and trying to push back against. I empathize with the situation they're in. So, I think it is important that leadership is consistent and creates an environment of not only support but also challenge and rigor if you want this way of developing public services to flourish. And so no, I don't think I do agree. I mean, clearly when you get into, as you rise up through an organization, you're not going to be rising up through it if you're not absorbing its culture and doing things that you need to do to excuse me, to get ahead, which is that expression that the greasy pole and all of that. Of course, that exists in public service organisations, but there's still, I'm absolutely committed to this idea. There are people in the main in public service organisations that are really trying to do the best thing they can, and often are doing that. They're finding get rounds. I'll tell you what, one of the things that we found as one of the best sources of knowledge about how to do things better has been to try to understand what are the get rounds that people use in dysfunctional organizations to get to try to achieve what they need to achieve as a professional on behalf of the people that they serve, despite the system. And sometimes those get rounds are really illuminating about what could be a longer term solution. So, I think in the main, people are really trying to make it work.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think the terminology that I would use there would be the waste, the dark matter. Chris Cooper would call it the dark matter. So where you've got high levels of bureaucracy, you've typically got high levels of waste and this dark matter, and all these workarounds, because it's a fixed hierarchical. You will do this. This is your checklist. And in a very complex environment and complex world, those checklists invariably are not fit for purpose most of the time. But the culture is such that you have to do it that way. I mean, recently I've been in, I can't give the detail, but a case in NHS England where there's been a policy written for good reason. Originally, the intention was good, but actually in a specific circumstance, that strict policy was absurd and was potentially either going to cost a lot of money to stick with, or it wouldn't happen and the results would be massive impact on citizens because the action that was required wouldn't get done. And it's hard without giving the real detail, but believe me, it's absurd. And yet the senior managers go with the standard policy because that's who they are. That's their identity. Their identity is we stick to the rules, even when the rules are absurd. And for me, that's where the leadership bravery comes in. We have to get to a point where we will challenge stupidity. And we can't, it's in this example, it was like millions of pounds at stake, and yet it wasn't challenged. And it was hundreds of millions of pounds in terms of the impact on citizens as well.
Of course, you only have to look at the feeble response of many agency leaders in the United States to the illegal usurpation of their responsibilities by the Trump government at the moment to see how compromised they allow themselves to be in some circumstances. And of course that happens in public service organizations as well. I don't deny that for a minute. But what I would say is that one of the reasons for that, I mean, what we found is when we talk to organizations about self-management and self-organized teams, in some cases what they tend to say is, "Oh, that sounds too risky." And one of the things that's really important, right, as you've mentioned, most organizations will have a rule book, this tool, with all sorts of absurdities in it. I mean, we often have to work with the organizations that we work with. One of the things we do is introduce a different approach. And some of the rules that you find out that when you open the rule book, it's things like telling people exactly how to open a window, presumably because at some point in the distant past, somebody opened a window the wrong way and they got a bad back and it was litigious and all of that. So, the solution is let's have a new rule about how you open a window rather than common sense. What we put in place, but nevertheless, a framework of obligation of normative standards, I should say, a framework of normative standards is really vital if you want to create an environment of trust in which freedom and responsibility can guide, can operate. And the frameworks that we put in place basically are pretty simple. That we obviously do this in dialogue with the organizational leaders, and we encourage them to do it in dialogue with the people they employ. But what they tend to do is just set up some operational standards about standards in relation to the work itself, standards in relation to how people work together within the organization and relate to each other, and standards about resource use. So the frameworks that we put in place tend to have these three categories. Usually it's only a page or two of A4, but they're really important because within that framework that you can have autonomy and with responsibility and transparency. But unless there is that framework, nobody really knows where their boundaries are. The second thing that's really important, it's related to that, you need to have real clarity and consistency about how authority is distributed around the organization. How much authority is vested in the primary process workers themselves? How much authority is vested in the board and for what things? It's important to have a real clarity, consistency, and coherence about how authority is distributed, and to have a framework which understands that. And so it's just as important for self-organized teams to work in accordance with the framework of their organization than it is, as it is, for them to be working with high levels of autonomy, creativity. Indeed, I would argue, and we've seen this at work, you can't really have the autonomy and the creativity unless it is bounded, and it has to be bounded in a way that makes sense for the purpose and practice of that organization.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think it feels like your approach there is really similar to what I'd call precepts in the Fit to Care book. I don't know if you got to that latter stage of the book, but that feels really similar to me. You've got the guidelines and the guardrails, if you like, in terms of how we operate as an organization and what our purpose is, and everything's geared around that. But within that, you've got the flexibility to make common sense decisions in unique scenarios where that policy doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. That's exactly. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and of course, that's those precepts, as you put it, or the framework, as the term we use, or guidelines, as some others say. Of course, you have to revisit that from time to time in the light of experience, and any one day you have to treat it. You have to treat it as a non-negotiable. But from time to time, as you build up your understanding, then you have to make some changes to it. That's inevitable and correct. But again, that policy, that process of learning, rather than just making it up all either on the hoof or being so rigid as to never review what you do, the sweet spot is actually revisiting it, learning it from time to time, but testing it out all the time. And that's the approach that we've taken. I mean, in the work that we did with Buurtzorg over those 7 or 8 years that we were partnered with Buurtzorg, one of the things I was very determined about, and I quite frankly, it pissed a few people off, but I was determined about this, was I thought, if we're going to work with Buurtzorg, and it was a big if at the beginning, I thought, is this going to help with what we're trying to do? And I decided, okay, they invited us to work with them as their partner in Britain. And we thought, okay, we're going to learn a lot from this. But I did always think that if we're going to work to introduce the way that Buurtzorg does it into Britain, we had to be rigorous about that. We weren't going to be able to learn about it and learn what adaptations and what creativity and what shifts from how Buurtzorg does something to how you can do it in a different environment. We weren't going to be able to do that unless we were pretty rigorous about learning how Buurtzorg actually does it, why they do it that way. And certainly also I had a very strong sense of responsibility when we were Buurtzorg's partner, that we were using their brand name. This is not just a commercial issue. For me, it was always an issue of, there are 15,000 people working for Buurtzorg in the Netherlands. They've given me the honor of allowing me to use their name in the British context, and I've got to be I've got to be a custodian of that and treat it very, very rigorously.
absolutely.
So we didn't want to. We wanted to really test out what the barriers and challenges were and learn from that, which we have done. And which is why now we're no longer partnering with Buurtzorg, because we think that was a period in which we were able to learn a great deal within the boundaries of the framework of that relationship that we can now put at the service of public service organizations more broadly. But I use that example because I don't think that learning can happen unless unless it's all that trust can grow unless there is an environment of rigor. And that rigor can be friendly, it can be loving, it can be companionable, it can be compassionate, and all of these things. But it can't be wishy-washy. It has to be. You need real clarity.
Which I think is a really great point, and I guess that ties into giving those leaders that need to be confident in making these sort of changes that there is some rigor there, and because it's not wishy-washy, they've got more confidence to go ahead and make some changes, I guess.
Yeah, that's the experience we've got is where, you know, leaders need to be able to allow sometimes mistakes to be made, of course, but also be able to see when they need to intervene. I mean, one of the organizations we work with, one of the things that the chief executive of that organization has started doing as a consequence of the work we're doing with them is every week he looks at all of the indicators in the organization that he's got access to. Some of them are visible on the dashboard of the IT system, some of them in other ways, but he looks at them as a deliberate discipline every week and thinks to himself, try and notice what the trends are. And these are performance indicators in effect, but he doesn't treat them as performance indicators to say, oh, you're falling short here, what are you going to do about it? He's treating those things as points of learning, and occasionally will think, okay, I'm going to go and ask, we notice that this is going on in your team or in your department. Let's have a conversation about why that's happening.
Absolutely.
And which is, so that's the rigor I'm talking about. A rigor to be really transparent and on it, but responding to the data and the knowledge and the information you get in a way that creates a learning environment.
Yeah, so it's learning all the way from the bottom right the way up to the top is the key, which I think everybody would agree on.
Yeah.
So getting down to brass tacks then, let's just paint some extreme pictures just to make the points. Let's say we've got an organization with some quite hardcore, extreme command and control, culture-driven managers that have risen through the ranks through that typical, I'd say my education and my accountancy degree, etc., my professional qualification in accounts, a lot of that has been driven down command and control, scientific management, metrics, driving performance, budgets, KPIs, all that sort of stuff. And that's my identity in a way. And that's how I've become a senior manager. That's me. I'm really good at it. I'm really efficient. I'm really good at chasing people and demanding that improvement happens. And that's how I've developed my career. How do you get that person to be open enough to see that there's better ways of working than that? That's a hard question, but how do you approach it? Because I assume you can picture that manager, and for that organization to work more optimally, you would want to convert them from that strict view into a more open and more learning approach. And if that is the case, then how do you get them to see the light?
Well, I think firstly, one step at a time. When we start to work with an organization, we like to start where the energy is. So who wants to make a change? Who wants to get going? Who wants to experiment? Who wants to be more creative? There are always people who do. Let's start there.
Yeah.
At the same time, and usually that's with primary process workers, professionals. At the same time, we are very open with organizational leaders and boards to say, however, although we're starting there and you're not committing to anything else at this point, we believe that as we go, you will learn about other changes need to happen in the organization to enable this way of working to flourish and to grow and to build more trust. So you've got to be open to the learning, and there will be things that go wrong, and it's a question of how you respond to things when they do go wrong. And by the way, from time to time, you know, that I'm not saying there's never any role for disciplinary processes. Occasionally that is the case. So you have to be open to that. What we find this is really crude, but it's broadly true. We find that workforces from top to bottom basically break into three categories. There are those who, given the chance to work in this, say, oh yeah, can I be first? I can't wait to get going. I've been waiting for somebody to give me this chance for years. Those who say, not quite sure. I think I'll just see how it goes with them. But take an interest in seeing how it goes with them and learning from it. And there are those who say, no, this isn't for me. I come to work to be told what to do each day. I don't, or to tell other people what to do each day. I'm not going to get into this, and count me out. Obviously, you don't start with the
Do you think those three categories apply for the people on? I'll try and stop using the front line, which is so common in the NHS. People that are in the work,
Yeah,
and
no, I do.
And the managerial leaders and managers. Do you think the same applies to both? There's three categories in both cohorts.
Yeah. As I say, it's a crude representation and it's broad, but yes, our experience is that those three categories, broadly speaking, are right. And of course, where do you start? You're never going to you're never going to start in that organization at all unless there's sufficient leadership commitment to enabling some experimentation, even if it's cautious, even if there's still quite a high level of risk aversity, and sort of, a tendency to abandon things at the first sign of a problem. You at least have to have a bit of an opening from leadership to say, okay, let's give it a go. You're not going to get anywhere, obviously, with an organization that's determined not to do that. But so starting in that way, where people have the energy, where they have the commitment to have a go, that's where you start. As a consequence of that, we have found that you can demonstrate and overcome the skepticism amongst other managers and amongst other parts of the primary process workforce. So they begin to say, oh, they seem to be enjoying their work in that team. Can we try it? And that's what tends to happen. And then there are those who say, no, I'm not going to. And those people tend to self-select out. As you grow this in an organization, they tend to self-select out. I'm working with one chief executive at the moment who's finding he's got a couple of his senior managers who do not like the direction of travel, who feel, as you were saying earlier, that their entire career has been based on a skill set and an approach that has served them very well so far, and they don't really know what their role would be in this future organization, and would rather not find out. And that's completely legitimate, but it's not going to happen for them if they stick with that mindset. It's not going to happen for them in that organization. So, as John Timpson puts it so elegantly about how Timpson's works, those people will probably have to find their happiness elsewhere.
Yeah. So in that scenario, the chief exec is absolutely critical to avoid potential meltdown of the whole program. If you've got some other senior managers that just it isn't for them, you do need that chief exec in that particular scenario to be able to keep it on track, I guess.
Yeah, and that's where the bravery comes in, isn't it? As we were talking about earlier, it does require courage to see it through, and courage to get it started. But there's plenty of courage in public service organizations. You'll never get me to abandon the idea that, in the main, create the right conditions for people to be able to work with a high level of responsibility and commitment and vocational and vocational commitment. The vast majority in public service organizations, including in managerial levels, will make that shift. But a minority are going to be the ones who drive it. That's the thing. So for completely understandable reasons. Yes, am I impatient about it sometimes? Obviously, who wouldn't be? But I also try to understand. If we want to build organizations that are compassionate and empathetic, then we have to also see what the pressures are on these people. So yes, the middle managers of that type are sometimes going to be getting in the way of change. They're certainly not going to be initiating it. But the skill of leadership is to create conditions where these tensions can play out, and enable change to take place at the pace of trust.
Yeah. And last question or two, because I'm sure the time's getting on now. The time's flying by. I'm getting a real feel, the more research that I do, the more people I speak to like you, that there's a real connection between getting these senior managers closer to those frontline workers, to stop saying frontline. And through that process, you can create a bit more of a connection and a bit more understanding and and generate that seed of how important the learning is. Because what I've found, a bit of a eureka moment for me about 18 months ago, was the gap between the guys at the top making the decisions and the people that are actually doing the work is vast in most cases. And it's that critical knowledge there where the work's getting done that is often the difference between failure with a lot of decisions and business cases and actually success. And bridging that gap is the key. And I think somehow enabling those leaders the space, the time and space to actually get closer to understand what's going on down here is massively important. I don't know if are you finding the same way in terms of your approach to get that happening?
I think that can help. But what I've also seen is where senior leaders in an organization have decided to, as you say, go and spend more time at the front line and find out what and get some intelligence about that, and then go back and make better decisions. And they probably will make better decisions. But wouldn't it be even better if they were to say, what I've seen suggests to me that if we were to invest more authority in these frontline professionals to do their jobs, to do the things that they're professionals at, to do the things that they're trained for, to do the things that they come into this organization to do, we create conditions where they can do that, that they can make more decisions that are suited to their they are the right local of that decision making. Wouldn't it be better to do that? And that's where we come into the clarity about how authority is distributed around the organization, being more clear.
You just hit the nail on the head in a massive way, because this does boil down to that paradigm shift, doesn't it? Away from command and control, and almost taking it right back to the privatization conversations that we were having earlier on, that senior people, smart people at the top know best, you do as you're told. Away from that paradigm to, no, we trust, we've got massive resources and assets in the organization with humans that are brilliant at what they do, really well qualified and expertise in what they do, have trust in them to do the right thing. Obviously, you need the other barriers and guardrails around that, training and etc. But haven't we just hit the nail on the head there? It's trust.
But yes, but I think it's not a question of having trust. It's a question of creating the organizational environment in which that trust is in which, yes, of course, the professionals are trusted to do what they're good at, but that's where as you say, the guardrails are very important, and being very consistent. So all parties then need to honor that.
Yes, it's earned trust, and allow it to thrive.
Yeah, yes. One of the organizations we worked in, they were so enthusiastic about self-organization. They said, all right, everybody, we trust you. Do what you need. And then some decisions started being made at team level, which basically couldn't be made at team level because they had an impact on budgeting. So then we had to have a conversation, okay, how much of budget can be devolved to that level? And what are the conditions of the devolution of that budget? And what can't be devolved to that level for wider organizational reasons? And through that, we were able to put in place the kind of framework I've been talking about. They'd hoped to get away without one. And they learned that wasn't going to happen. So, and of course, you can't necessarily set these things up in stone from the get-go, but creating an environment in which you can experiment in this way and then make some adjustments to the distribution of authority over time, make some adjustments to the framework over time. But the only way you can do that is if everybody is committed to treating those small number of rules with respect. I mean, let's face it, all these huge rule books that organizations have, nobody even looks at them, and they're finding ways around them all the time. What we need is much fewer rules that are based on normative standards, norms rather than exceptions, and which people do honour because they make sense.
Yes, yeah, I'm with you completely. And just to consolidate all that, I've taken a lot from John Bavacki and his work. And what I get from that in this context is we need the Gestalt picture. So the senior managers, the chief execs need to be understanding the environment, need to be understanding politics, cash flow, all those sorts of things, massively important and skilled. And at the same time, we need all that feature level knowledge and expertise. And the two have got to work in harmony. There's got to be that absolute communication between the two, and it all comes together. That's how I see it.
I mean, of course, there are specialisms. I would argue that in self-organized teams in public service organizations, actually, teams need to know quite a bit about cash flow, and they need to know quite a bit about budgeting and how resources are used and so on, and what the constraints are on resources. That's not just somebody else's job. I think, one of the responsibilities of public service workers is to use whatever resources they've got as well as they can. But I mean, in all of these things, how you get change, we've been talking about how you get started and how you sustain this kind of organizational change. One thing I really believe in is Leonard Cohen says it nicely, doesn't he? He says, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The way I would put it is, there's always some space, and you use the space you've got, even if it's not much space, but use the space you've got to be creative, because that's that way you'll create a larger space. That's very different from complaining that there's not enough space. Of course, there's not enough space.
Yeah.
But of course, there never is. But use the space you've got, then you'll get more. I'm a real believer in that.
Yeah. I believe your work and the human learning systems approach, and working with other colleagues that are experts in lean and Toyota methodology and that sort of thing. There's so much waste in public services because of all the bureaucracy, that as soon as you start this work, you can release a lot of capacity, because there's a lot of waste in the system where people are working workarounds, loads of dysfunction, creates a massive amount of work. And you can, if you start to work like we're suggesting, you can unlock a lot of that work, which is repetitive and not necessary if you just get it done right the first time.
Just
lots of scope.
Massive amount of failure demand in the system, isn't there? To use that expression, but it's a good expression, because that's exactly what it is. It's demand caused by failure to get things right the first time. Of course, you're never going to always get things right the first time, but the more you can move in that direction, and for that you need the professionals to be able to work with high levels of freedom and responsibility. And I think there is some exciting things going. I mean, you mentioned the human learning systems people, and basically they've highlighted essentially what they've done is highlight a number of interesting and promising shifts that are taking place in public service organizations, and that's a good thing to do, because it will inspire people to have a go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground there. I don't think I've got as deep on one of these before, so I don't know if there's any other questions that will fit in after that level of conversation.
Well, we've been going at it quite some time, so we probably ought to call it whole. But it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, Anthony. And as I say, I really admire the work you're doing and the book you've written, which must have, I've written a couple of books, and I know it ain't easy.
No, it's painful.
Yeah, it is. It's a tough thing to do, and you've put it together, and you've elaborated from the material you gathered together in a really interesting way. So I hope people read the book, and I'd be interested to know what the nurses made of it when they saw their testimony in print. Were they pleased?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting question. That's almost back to the culture. Is I'd say roughly 50% weren't comfortable enough, given their environments and their cultural settings, to put their name to it.
Oh God, I can believe that.
So I mean, that tells a story in its own right, doesn't it?
tells the story in many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think I'm really honoured that they took the time to spend with me. And just were open and honest, which is great. And hopefully we'll make a difference to people reading it and picking things up. There's a lot crossover what you do. I'd love to learn more about what you're doing and some of the case studies that you've got going on, because I'm sure there's a lot I can learn.
Well, likewise, and we can all learn from each other, and we continue to do that in the spirit of common endeavour and humility. Then together we'll be building a movement, and I think that is underway. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I don't know if you've got any. Have you got a group on LinkedIn or what?
Yeah, we've got Humanity at the Heart. We've got our online community, which is a Mighty Networks community, Humanity at the Heart. But we've also very recently started a Humanity at the Heart group on LinkedIn. Yeah, and so we open to anyone who wants to join it, who's broadly speaking shares what we're trying to do.
Well, I'll definitely join. I sort of do everything on LinkedIn, so I'll definitely join.
Great, we'll look forward to that.
And quick last one, you might want to pick this up afterwards, but I built an AI system called Insight Genie, purposefully with a view to try and bridge that gap between managers at the top that just don't have the time or the resources to access that insight from the workers on. I cannot get away from the frontline word at the moment.
Yeah, we'll live with it.
But that's a mission of mine, is to try and industrialize, or make it a lot easier, I should say, to make it a lot easier for the decision makers at the top to glean that information quickly. So if that is something that could help your work, then it'd be great to work with you and do a case study or a use case with it.
Well, I'd love to look at that, actually, Anthony, because we have found the development of IT systems suited to the purpose that we have, have been really difficult, and adapting. I mean, obviously, the organizations we work with are finding ways to adapt the software that they use the best they can to their purposes. But a lot of it is, just trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and it's quite difficult. And in some cases, the kit just isn't there. So yeah, be really interested to have a look at it and see. So let's try and set something up so I can do that.
Okay, fantastic. So I really appreciate it. So just before we close, what's your favourite song? Just to tie it back to Desert Island Discs.
You threatened me with this, and I didn't give it enough thought. So let me think what my favourite song is just at the moment. I think, but I think for this purpose, I'm going to go with Fun, 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 one of the Beach Boys' very first singles, because what we need at work more is fun, fun, fun. So I'll go with that one.
I'm with you. Okay, brilliant. If I had a production team, I would set the song up at the end of this interview, but I'm not sure I'm going to have time. But it's a nice one to think about.
All right.
Thanks ever so much, Brendan. Really appreciate it.
Cheers, Anthony. It's been lovely talking to you. Could have gone on for longer. It's such a pleasure. Yeah, thanks very much.
We could.